This paper will explore the nature of the remarkably similar misunderstandings both progressivism and psychoanalysis are susceptible to in the current political moment. Specifically, it will examine how hypostatization in public perception towards both politics and psychoanalysis engenders a cultural climate of false expectation and resultant hostility, and to what extent these misunderstandings are cultivated or inadvertent, conscious or unconscious. I'll begin this afternoon with an example of how unwarranted concreteness has misled by discussing a misstep in early psychoanalysis's primal scene. Freud mistakenly searched for the literal and material act as the cause of psychopathology before he realized it is the work of the mind, a fantasy, that should be sought. One of my central topics I'll be addressing today has to do with the relation between thwarted, unrealistic expectation of both psychoanalysis and progressivism, and the emergence of a negative public response. I postulate that people literalize the theoretical and carry that critical misinterpretation with them into either the political arena or the psychoanalytic consulting room. In a word, reification. After reifying false expectations, one can only be let down by what is practically achievable. These disillusioned citizens or patients feel deep ambivalence towards the schools of thought and the people who embody them. The negative aspect of that ambivalence draws upon unconscious misreadings, as we saw in the political campaign just behind us. This unconscious misleading may be built upon to construct conscious misleading, what we are familiar with in the form of propaganda and spin. Now to turn to my first point. When Sigmund Freud was in the early stages of theorizing possible root causes for his patients' hysterical and neurotic conditions, he flirted briefly with what is called his seduction theory. In essence, that any patient so afflicted had, in their childhood, an actual instance of sexual abuse which had been repressed from conscious memory, resulting in the adult symptom that required treatment. Freud subsequently swiftly abandoned the notion of childhood molestation being universal amongst his patients, and theorized that it was actually his patients' sexual fantasy lives in childhood from which the adult pathology stemmed. The fantasized, repressed childhood sexual trauma would emerge in Freudian thought as the anxieties surrounding the Oedipal triad. Critic Malcolm Bowie observes, "Much of our information about Freud's view of knowledge and of the power that knowledge might confer, the desires it might serve, and the delights and torments to which it might summon the mind, is to be had from the jumps, repetitions, and hesitations in his writings, from its incidents, accidents, and switches in direction." This holds true of Freud's early theoretical miss in terms of seduction theory, which touches upon multiple issues I'll be addressing today. Chief amongst them, the concept of reification, a term in use within both psychoanalytic and Marxist thought, whereby an abstract is imbued with the properties of material reality. Insofar as Freud's seduction theory was based on the occurrence of literal childhood assault, rather than the equivalent in the child's fantasy life, he was snared by the lure of reification. As I will subsequently discuss, reification specifically of overinflated expectation is one of the issues that dogs both progressivism and psychoanalysis. As an aside, while reflecting on the various meanings of reification and by extension the variety of forms materialism can take, it occurred to me that Freud's seduction theory, while unarguably flawed, might hold a kernel of greater value than is immediately evident if the concept of sexual abuse is approached from a historically materialist perspective. Instead of the abuse in this specific context being conceived of as assault, a single traumatic event or pattern of intrusive sexual episodes in childhood, it could be theorized as persistent and pervasive societal abuse that Freud's patients endured throughout their lives because it was their expected lot as younger women at the end of the 19th century. While first-wave feminism was gaining momentum as Freud developed his seduction theory, it was a long time before it reached cultural saturation. Women in practice, if not in law, were expected to go from their father's household to their husband's. They generally enjoyed far more limited rights and opportunities in society than their male contemporaries. Freud's instinct to recognize the female patients who presented their symptoms to him as products of an injurious past, predicated upon their sexuality, was valid. He was just too literal in hypothesizing a past childhood sexual trauma, rather than looking for the constricting bands of patriarchal hegemony that had been squeezing these girls throughout their lives until their symptoms broke out. To transpose this into the modern parlance, Freud was looking for rapes when he should have been looking at a rape culture. 4. As the justifiable accusations of phallocentricism leveled against Freudian theory in general, and his case studies of female patients in particular demonstrate, Freud himself was a product of the same society that had a hand in damaging his patients. Freud had attended Charcot's lectures at Salpêtrière and seen the hysteric female patient reduced to a kind of prop, a prime example of objectification. On that scale, Freud's approach and its emphasis on paying attention to his patients' contributions was thoroughly progressive. However, the ear he listened with was not as sensitively attuned as 21st, or indeed late 20th, century standards would demand, resulting in those recurring moments throughout Freud's writings where, read now, he sounds tone-deaf. By suggesting that the patriarchal hegemony of the culture in which they lived was responsible for some of the damage in his patients that Freud initially misattributed to childhood sexual assault, I am neither downplaying nor ignoring Freud's subsequent theoretical advance that placed the trauma in the child's fantasy life. When a girl is growing up circumscribed by limitations that very few around her seem to question, it is within her fantasy life that her reactions will naturally play out. In Freudian terminology, it was his patient's cathextion or investment of libidinal energy in response to both the specifics of their situations, as laid out in Freud's case studies, and the generally chafing nature of the society in which they lived that resulted in the emergence of the hysterical symptom. In seduction theory, Freud believed that his patients repressed the memory of their assaults. As in all cases of repression, he believed the patient was unconsciously deceiving herself. One amongst the mechanisms of defense would later be anatomized more assiduously by his daughter Anna. Though this theory of repression may seem painfully simple from a modern perspective, during the time of Freud's practice, it was not uncommon for hysterical patients to be labeled malingerers, feigning their symptoms. To carry on with the central thrust of my argument, the distinction Freud drew between a conscious lie and the more nuanced phenomenon of the mistruth the patient herself believes will be key moving forward as I discuss the public conception of both progressive thought and psychoanalysis. Both psychoanalysis and progressive political thought suffer from a series of parallel misapprehensions in the wider cultural world that may lack substance but are addressed as though they were fact. These are false expectations in that they are predicated upon a lack of understanding, and that they elaborate upon that to construct unreasonably high demands. These false expectations are effectively reified as the initial misconception is propagated and becomes a matter that those in practice must address. One of the underlying misconceptions that plague both progressivism and psychoanalysis is the conflation of their theoretical and practical models. This can take a variety of forms. Political theorists are largely independent of, and therefore can enjoy a freer reign than, the politician in the field. The theorists can inflate the expectation of what can be accomplished beyond what is practically feasible, cultivating disappointment in a politician's supporters while giving her opposition an opportunity to charge her with ideological weakness or inconsistency. In psychoanalysis, where the theorist is often also a practitioner, a different sort of confusion can emerge. From Freud onwards, psychoanalytic theory has been constructed on the bedrock of case study, although the stability of some of those structures has been revealed to be shaky as time goes on. Case studies, incomplete, unsuccessful, or flawed analyses abound, yet that a body of critical work should produce models of the structure and workings of the mind and the pathologies that plague it, presented in the authoritative fashion that a kind of declarative theorization demands, can give the impression to one reading selectively that psychoanalysis, and by extension the psychoanalyst, has all the answers. The tone of specifically early analysts intent on establishing psychoanalysis as a credible science contributed to this fallacy until it became entrenched and reified. In analysis of the clinical transference, the patient's expectation and preconceptions about the process and its results offer potentially productive entry points. By stating that analysts and politicians suffer from the public's misunderstanding of the distinction between the theoretical and practical, I'm by no means suggesting that theoreticians should limit themselves. I'm simply identifying the reification of false expectation as one source of antipathy towards psychoanalysis and progressivism, and examining how those false expectations may have emerged. So, both the psychoanalyst and progressive politician is faced with the unrealistic expectation to produce ideal results, a society of utopian fairness, a patient that is cured. They are both expected to accomplish this with relative alacrity. Election cycles lend limits to the scope of a politician's agenda, while exposing her to a recurrent acid test of public opinion. And analytic patients can have limited resources in terms of funds, time, or indeed patience. Allow me to briefly address the perhaps self-evident issue of why these expectations are unrealistic, yet why they still might be generally harbored. In the political sphere, the progressive project generally demands some reevaluation and reshaping of the existing power structures, a delicate demolition and subsequent restructuring. Whether addressing the organizing principles of Marx or Fromm, anyone can recognize it as a radical paradigm shift that will take time to achieve. But because the conflation between theory and practice just discussed occurs largely subconsciously, the public expectation can be reduced to the politician achieving the ends of the theorist with only the inadequate practical means at his disposal. Furthermore, I believe there is a reason that the aphorism "easier said than done" rolls so trippingly off the tongue. The adage resonates in an unconscious part of the mind, still operating under a form of infantile narcissism that does not accept that. As Freud observed, in dreams, an object or event can symbolize its opposite. I submit that in common usage, when "easier said than done" is uttered, the meaning is constituted partly of the wish that saying something would make it so, and partly of the regret that reality testing consistently shows this not to be the case. In psychoanalysis, all too often, the patient presents themselves for treatment expecting the medical model, whereby diagnosis, treatment, and declaration of cure all originate from the practitioner. In the psychoanalytic clinical method, however, much of the responsibility lies with the patient. Not only must she be the one to generate material within the session, but it is her choice whether to accept the proffered interpretations of the analyst or affirm when or what progress has been accomplished. The patient is, in truth, the engine of the psychoanalytic process. She might, however, cling to the transferential notion that the analyst possesses the solutions, but is for some reason withholding. Alternatively, she might recognize that the analyst is not the keeper of any arcane secret, but feel cheated by that realization, leading to an underassessment of psychoanalytic treatment's potential, or even the charge of charlatanism. I alluded to such negative responses earlier. The politician and psychoanalyst are the subjects of antipathy when they naturally fail to satisfy the false expectations held over them. Dislike plays into this dynamic, but crucially so does distrust. This is particularly striking in the modern political arena, where after the advent of television and now online social media, so much is made of a political candidate's performance aesthetic. Yet more so than ever, the broad caricature of corrupt politician is recognized, fueled in this country by the coverage of expensive scandals in recent years. Public perception of therapists can be equally cartoonish, although they can run the range from prying to disinterested. What these characterizations share is that their subjects are perceived as hopelessly out of touch with the issues they are meant to address. It must be pointed out at this juncture that not only the progressive politician or the psychoanalytically oriented analyst is vulnerable to these misconceptions and accompanying antipathy. Specifically, in the run-up to Thursday's elections, much was made of the public's lack of faith in the political establishment and the political class that populated it. This disillusionment was seen to scythe across the political spectrum and can be credited for previously marginal parties on both the right and left gaining far greater national attention they had previously received, although not necessarily in all cases, as we saw, a proportionate amount of the vote. And by the same token, almost anyone who works in psychology or psychiatry, not exclusively the psychoanalyst, will recognize the experience of introducing your profession in a social setting, only to be greeted with some variation of "don't analyze me" or "don't reveal what I'm thinking." An illustration in itself of the prevalence and depth of the misconceptions about the role of analysts. Though other stripes of politics and psychology are susceptible to similar phenomenon, both psychoanalysis and progressive thought are especially vulnerable. The radical nature of the progressive political project and the relative non-interventionist stance of the clinical psychoanalyst both have the capacity to engender a level of vitriol that draws upon unconscious misreadings and devolves into conscious misleading, propaganda, and spin. Until this point, I've been discussing unconscious processes in the public perception of analysts, politicians, and their disciplines. Unconscious processes do not follow a linear logic. The reification of false expectation, the resultant disappointment as at their failure to be fulfilled, and the subsequent backlash do not occur in succession, but simultaneously. Roughly analogous to my example of the aphorism, easier said than done. The unconscious wish for a thing to be so exists alongside and despite the experiential knowledge that it is unlikely or impossible. The public may, to an extent, recognize their desired results are overblown, but being unreasonable blunts surprisingly little of a wish's force. By this mechanism, the public may be both disillusioned with the analyst and politician's ability to achieve expected results, whilst the expectations for those results persists unabated, creating an ambivalence in public perception. It's only necessary to acknowledge the importance of the edible conflict in Freudian thought to recognize the potential power of ambivalence. When conceiving seduction theory, Freud mistook the trauma of the ambivalence of the edible stage for literal trauma. His mistake was repeated and perpetuated on a wider scale in the late 20th century by overzealous analysts engaging in the raft of treatments collectively referred to as recovered memory treatment. This illustrates how strong external influence can thumb the scales of ambivalence towards the negative. In the political arena, such external influence is self-evident. The opponents of progressive politicians act out of a desire to see themselves or their conflicting Weltanschauungen triumph, a melange of personal ambition and ideological loyalty that further complicates the public's relationship with all political figureheads, regardless of affiliation. As I previously mentioned, the familiar tools of propaganda and spin are especially potent against progressive thought because progressivism entails change. To return briefly to Thursday's election, one of the final Conservative Party television ads to be released before polling day was titled, "It's Working." I'm not sure how many people actually saw that broadcast. It pictured an intricate clock mechanism under a glass dome, examined lovingly by the camera while a voiceover recited the Conservatives' accomplishments. Predictably, it culminated with the clock being sledgehammered. The result, the ad tells us, of a Conservative defeat. A progressive victory is not metaphorically changing the time or even trading in the style of clock. It equals wanton destruction, is the propaganda message of the ad. Even when the Conservative Party is not the incumbent, they can invoke the powerful specter that progressivism will equate to destruction. The near pathological opposition to President Barack Obama's 2010 reform of the American healthcare system was characterized by laments of the radical and disruptive nature of the change, and the bill remained a critical campaign issue in his bid to win a second term, and has remained a live political talking point. I submit that this conscious misleading that progressivism destroys without replacing draws energy from an unconscious misreading. The misreading that progressive theories and aspirations are concrete and immediately achievable, engendering disillusionment and ambivalence when reality falls short of the ideal. I previously mentioned the blurred lines in public perception between the practical and the theoretical models of progressive politics and psychoanalysis. I'd like to return to that point now to draw out a related conflation that occurs within both theoretical models. Rather than being an unconscious phenomenon, this is encouraged by the opponents of progressivism and psychoanalysis. Both encompass myriad skeins of thought that have been put into practice over time with a range of results. An identification in public consciousness can be encouraged, linking, for example, Marxist thought and the worst of Stalinist abuses, or to discredit Freud by highlighting his association with Fleiss, or for that matter, by narrowing the focus to some of the work he later abandoned, such as seduction theory. Nor is effectiveness a matter of tremendous difficulty. Relatively few members of the public devote themselves to understanding the nuance of progressivism or psychoanalysis, and are therefore reliant on summaries. Any summary, by its very nature, will strip away some of the subtleties and distinctions. And it is those subtleties that not only distinguish the body of progressivism and psychoanalysis from its most extreme fringes and iterations, but also bolster some of its central ideas. Abbreviated versions of notions as complex as the edible conflict or childhood sexuality are susceptible to crude caricature. This negative spin produces a synecdochic effect, whereby a single voice within the psychoanalytic or progressive community is mistaken for the voice of the entire movement. For a practical view of how this sort of confusion can be exploited in the political arena, we need to look no further back than the right-wing characterization of Ed Miliband as Red Ed, while attempting to make him take responsibility for and identify with the Marxist politics of his father, Ralph Miliband. The practice of anti-progressive propaganda owes a degree of its success to capitalizing upon its target's ambivalence, derived from the disappointment at unrealized, unrealistic expectations from the progressive political project. In conclusion, a nod to the past and avenues for further exploration. As long ago as Wilhelm Reich's 1929 Dialectical Materialism and Psychoanalysis that we just heard summarized so expertly and contextualized so well, it has been argued that misinterpretation lies at the root of perceived misalignment between progressive Marxist-inspired thought and psychoanalysis. The contemporary moment offers the opportunity to re-examine that idea in the context of an information-saturated, progressively polarized political climate, with little patience for subtle distinction and an accompanying general disgust and distrust of the political class. Psychoanalysis, itself a subject of widespread misapprehension, cannot and should not be called upon to offer up a remedy. However, it has much to offer because of its clinical methodology, with its emphasis on the process and the material generated therein, and its history of addressing the pathology of reification. And reification is, after all, another name for the conversion disorders Freud and Brewer initially observed. Psychoanalysis allows the opportunity to explore the current tension between the expectation and condemnation, and further the political psychoanalytic discourse. The furtherance of this discourse can yield insight into the prevalent hostility toward both the psychoanalytic and the political, with specific attention to the targeting and marginalization of progressive thought.